And we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started. And I haven't done something like this for a while because last week the lesson didn't go as planned for me. Typically, what I have found is that I script out my lesson. It's generally speaking right around 10 pages. Sometimes it's 9, sometimes it goes to an 11th page. And that usually fills the time that we have. Last week, I only made it through about 7.5 pages, and I had 12 pages to get through. I knew I was going to need my track shoes last week. I didn't have them, and so rather than let that preparation go to waste, we're going to pick up here this week. So this week's going to be just it's a little bit different. So to that end, we're going to take a little bit of time and we're going to recap what we went over last week in case there are some of you here that were not here last week. And the more that I've sort of dwelled on this over the course of the week, because there's part of me that's like, how on earth did that happen? I've come to realize that it's probably really good that we didn't force it all into last week. I think some of the stuff just takes a little bit of time to percolate. I don't know what the right word is, but to fully cook for you. You've probably heard me say this before, but I have learned that people need to be reminded so much more than they need to be taught. And and the way I typically try to illustrate that is that are there things that we know we should do, and we probably all can make a list of things that we know we should do. And the other side of that is, are you doing those things that you know you should be doing? And if you're anything like me, the answer to that on more than one occasion is no, I'm not. I'm not doing those things. So you need to be reminded. It's not that you don't know, you just need to be reminded. You need to be pointed in the right direction. So I was curious, just who was here last week? Okay, those of you who were here last week, what do you remember about last week, if anything? Does anybody remember anything from last week? Asking questions is good. Asking the right questions, that's a special skill that we have to develop, right? I was trying to illustrate this last week by asking a bad question. And the bad question I asked was this: who was the fourth king of Judah? Does anybody remember me asking that question last week? Of which then Sarah called me out on it. I wasn't. This is what happens when you don't prepare properly. Is you just say, "Oh, well, who was the fourth king of Judah?" And then the idea was for it to be illustrative, I think, illustrative. I don't know how you pronounce that. But then when you get called out, who was the fourth king of Judah? Now, to the benefit of this group, Brother Tim came up afterwards and he said, yes, the fourth king was Rehoboam. And I get that, but I need to just give you this teaching, because the Rehoboam was not the name that I was looking for. Just as a little bit of Bible history, when the Israelites come out of Egypt, they go into the Promised Land. They lived for about 400 years without a king. They lived for 400 years with God as their king, and then they were just governed by a series of judges. That's why in your Bible you have the book of Judges. But then eventually the Israelites get to the point where they say, you know what, we really want an earthly king, okay? And so God finally said, if that's what they want, that's what we'll give them. He's like, these people are a little bit stubborn, and they were. And so anybody remember who the first king of Israel was? Saul. There we go. So we have Saul. And then Saul was replaced. Who took over after Saul? Anybody remember? David. All right. And after David, it was Solomon. And then what happened is when Solomon died, he was giving way to his son, who was Rehoboam. This is who Tim told me last week. I gotta figure out how to spell this. Rehoboam. But he wasn't a very good leader. And the people said something to him like, "Hey, would you cut our taxes?" And Rehoboam said, "No, if you thought the taxes were bad before, they're going to be worse now." And it led to the country actually divided. It divided in two. And so what we ended up having is we have a Jeroboam who would become the first king of Israel, of the divided kingdom, and Rehoboam would be the first king of the kingdom of Judah. This was the pathway I was intending to go down. So who was the fourth king? Rehoboam would be replaced by Abijah, Abijah, replaced by King Asa, replaced by King Jehoshaphat. I don't know how to spell that. So Sarah, there's your answer. I researched it. I hope now, if you ask me who the fourth king of Israel was on the other side, I did not research that. I did not, but remember that. But the point of that was only ask people questions that they know the answer to. Does anybody remember that from last week? Only ask people questions that they know the answer to, because when you ask people questions that they don't know the answer to, it turns them off, right? It pushes them away. And that was the point of that part of the teaching. Now, I don't know about you, but I've actually developed a pretty nasty habit, and it's watching Instagram Reels for way too long. And every once in a while, though, you'll come across one and you'll be like, "Oh my goodness, this one's really good. I can use this to illustrate something." Has anybody ever watched an Instagram Reel? Okay, a few of you have. Has anybody ever sent an Instagram Reel to somebody else? Sarah's giving me a look. So an Instagram Reel is just it's maybe about a minute long. It's just a short video. Okay, and you look at it and it's usually funny. A lot of them, well, I won't tell you the ones that I watch. If you have any respect for me, you'll lose it if I tell you the Instagram Reels that I watch. I send them to Trace and she'll just vouch for me. Just, you don't want to know. But it was interesting. I came across one not too long ago that actually featured Jeff Foxworthy, the You Might Be a Redneck comedian, right? And he's doing this bit where he said, I got this text message, and the text message said, "Please pray for Larry. He was in a bad accident." And so Jeff said, "Oh, wow." And he goes to his wife and he says, "Hey, I just got a text. Have you seen this? Have you've seen this, Gary?" He goes to his wife and he says, "Hey, I just got a text message. It said, please pray for Gary, who's been in a bad accident." And so immediately then the wife began asking questions. It was, "Well, where did the accident take place?" And Jeff says, I don't know. I just got a text message saying, "Please pray for Larry. He was in a bad accident." "Well, what hospital did they take him to?" "I don't know. I just got a text message saying, please pray for Larry. He was in a bad accident." "Well, was anybody else with him?" I don't know. I don't know. I just got a text message saying, please pray for Larry. He was in a bad accident." But at the end of the bit, though, you get this feeling that maybe Jeff shouldn't have told his wife that little thing, right? Because when you ask people that they don't know the answers to, they want to pull back, they want to pull away, they want to turn off, right? This is such an important thing. Now, the bit was played for laughs, but maybe some of that is familiar to you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like that? And doesn't it just illustrate the importance of asking good questions? Right? I think that's where it was. Now, the reason that we're looking at this topic of asking questions, it's based on something we read several weeks ago in Proverbs chapter 9, verses 7, 8, and 9. If you want to pull this up, we'll just look at this again. But Proverbs chapter 9, verses 7 through 9 reads, "Whoever corrects a mocker invites insults, and whoever rebukes the wicked incurs abuse. Do not rebuke mockers, or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise, and they will love you. Instruct the wise, and they will be wiser still, and teach the righteous, and they will add to their learnings. And when we looked at this, and this has probably been the better part of 2 months ago now, when we looked at these proverbs, we noted how Jesus would often find himself with people who would try to challenge and mock him. And Jesus, being the embodiment of wisdom, he recognized that he didn't just have to give them instruction, he had to change the way that they thought. He had to challenge them in a different way. And he would do that by asking questions, which is what put us down this pathway. And what I've come to realize is that good questions can be transformational. Good questions can be transformational. But learning to ask good questions is not easy. And in fact, if you're anything like me, if you decide to go down this path of learning to ask better questions, you may very well find it to be uncomfortable. And you will probably find it to be slow. But with time and repetition, these questions may just be your secret weapon to be able to connect with lost people and to point them to Jesus. So as we study the life of Jesus, we find that Jesus was actually asking questions from a very young age. We looked at this story last week, found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 41. I'll just tell you the story. But Jesus had gone with his family to Jerusalem for Passover. And apparently at that time, the men traveled separate from the women. And they had traveled, they were traveling home, and his parents got a couple of days away, and then they realized, we don't have Jesus. And they go back to Jerusalem to look for him. And after searching Jerusalem for I think it was 3 days, they finally found him in the temple. In verse 46, Luke chapter 2, verse 46, it reads, after 3 days they found Jesus in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And if you weren't here last week, let me just encourage you to consider circling those words, asking them questions. I had heard that story, I don't know how many times in my life. I had never read that story and picked up on the asking questions part of it. So last week we noted that that questions can help people learn, and Jesus would actually use questions to help people draw out their faith, to challenge wrong thinking, to invite commitment, and to prompt personal reflection and discernment. We've talked about how wisdom and truth are not afraid to be questioned. That they welcome the questions because the wisdom and truth will win out. And to that end, we should not be scared of people to ask us questions as well. We talked about that a little bit last week, about how sometimes the enemy comes at us and tries to discourage us from sharing with people because, well, what if they ask us a question, right? And I don't know about you, but I know that that's derailed me a time or two. And so that's where we want to start to dig in here today. We don't need to be so worried about people asking us questions that we don't have the answer to. We need to recognize that that's an opportunity for us to grow. So we ended up last week, I was telling you the difference between different types of questions. So I'm going to start here today, and this is where our recap is going to end. But questions I break into two different arms. You have closed-ended questions, closed-ended, and you have open-ended. Now, the difference between these two types of questions is this. Closed-ended questions can typically get answered in one word, right? Did you have a good sleep last night? Yes, no, right? Is it cold outside today? Yes. It's something that you can, something that it has a very, very short answer. Whereas an open-ended question, you can get a long answer. There is no set, there is no there's no maximum to how long that answer could go. Now, uh, the way that these questions are typically worded start with the either how, what, or why. So if I was to say to you, what are you going to do after church today? That is an open-ended question. If you answer it as a closed-ended question and you say yes, that becomes awkward, right? What are you going to do after church today? Yes. Like that's odd, right? I mean, we've been in that situation too, on either end. Some of us ask us a question and we answer it the wrong way. Have you been there? Okay, right? So what I have found, and I'm sharing with you just my experience and what I found, is that open-ended questions can open all sorts of doors for you. Okay. But I'm going to tell you that while these three questions, how, what, and why questions are great, I want to caution you against the why questions. I am not a fan of why questions because why questions typically can come across as accusatory. Why are you being an idiot? A different way that you could ask that question is, what made you think that was a good idea? How did you come to that decision? Right? You're allowed to think, why are you being in it? You're allowed to think that. I'll give you permission for that, right? But like just understand that when you think of these, and this is what I've had to do, is I had to realize that there's a bunch of questions that I may have, but I have to take that question and it's sort of like almost, well, maybe a Rubik's Cube or a puzzle or a clay, whatever. You have to massage it in some way to get it to the point where you can ask it in a different way, to start with how or what. And I'm going to tell you, if you take the time and you do that, it has the potential to really help you connect with people so much better. The simple way that I will tell you to do that is just to write down the question that you want to ask and then spend some time figuring, okay, how can I re-say this question, reword this question to be able to start with how or what, right? But you can use why, but I just encourage you to be cautious with this. Now, I tell you all of that because this is where I wanted to get to. Several years ago, it was over at the CMA Church. They had a workshop one Saturday from the Worldview Academy. Worldview Academy came to town, and they were talking about how you would be able to share your faith with people, because there's all sorts of different worldviews out there. There's people that see things, maybe as you do, but maybe it's just a little bit off. I actually got a text message from a friend of mine this week, and he said, Jess, I want you to know I had an interesting conversation with a Muslim today. I didn't realize it, but we serve the same God. And I had to say, well, this is probably a longer conversation than a text message, right? So, but one of the things that I got from this Worldview Academy training that they did is they gave us 3 questions. I'm going to turn the board. Maybe I'll turn the board for this. They equipped us with 3 questions. I want you to observe, are these open or closed-ended questions? Question number 1. What happens when you die? I'm going to warn you. This isn't how you start conversations. You don't walk up to somebody and just say, What happens when you die? Right? You got to get you got to get some common ground before that. But if you want to be able to transition into some type of spiritual conversation, you could ask them, what happens when you die? Is this an open-ended question, closed-ended question? Open, right? Follow-up question, how can you be sure? Open or closed-ended? Open, open, right? And the last question was, what if you're wrong? Now imagine this. You run into, you're at the grocery store, you run into an old friend you haven't seen for a long time. And you do a little bit of catching up, and it was a pretty good friend, and you find that it's been a number of years, but you catch up real quick, and you come to find out that they have a family member who is terminal, and they're pretty torn up about it. You may be able to say, what do you think happens when you die? What type of answers do you think you might get to that? Has anybody had a conversation like this?
The answer I got one time was nothing.
Okay, nothing.
That's the end of it.
What if you're wrong? What if it ends and all of a sudden, oh, there's another chapter, right? There's a post-credit scene to the movie, right? What is that? I'm going to suggest you there's a lot of people that if you were to say, what happens when you die? They say, well, if you're a good person, you get some type of reward. And if you're not a good person, there's some type of torment, right? Like, would you be surprised if somebody answered that way? There's a lot of people that are just like, oh, because there's a lot of people that just say, oh, what do you think's going to happen to Aunt Sally? Well, she was a pretty good person. She'll probably be all right. Huh. How can you be sure about that? Right? And I share these questions because I want you to wrestle with these questions. I want you to be able to answer these questions. I'm not going to give you the answers. I'm not going to give you the answers. I want you to be able to answer these questions in your words. This is an equipping lesson today. But like these are just some examples for you. But why I share these with you is that you see how open-ended questions can do this. Now, let me go back. I was watching Instagram Reels, and I came across one that had a reasonably famous atheist on it. I'm not going to give his name because I don't know that that's necessary for it. But the atheist was giving a lecture on a college campus, and now his lecture was done, and he was taking questions from the audience. And there was a young lady in the audience who said, hey, this is probably an easy question for you, but I'm just curious, based on what you've shared with us today, what if you're wrong? And as I watched that, he did not answer the question. He sidestepped the question, and he tried to make an excuse of, well, I refuse to believe that just because based on where you were born and the value sets that you have, that if you were born in India, you would be Hindu. If you were born somewhere else, you would be Muslim. If you're, just based on where you were born, that would be the determination of it. He did answer the question, what happens if you're wrong? Now, as I listened to his explanation, I thought, well, this is somebody who doesn't have an understanding of the challenge that we are given as believers. There are people that are born into this world that perhaps have some type of disadvantage, that are born into a scenario where their beliefs are corrupted or are incomplete in some way, shape, or form. But is not the Great Commission our challenge and invitation to do something about that? Right? We have those things. And so, to that end, I think that I think that's one of those questions that we need to be able to ask, or that we need to be able to answer. Maybe that's the better way. You need to be able to answer that question. If somebody says you're this follower of Jesus, what happens if you're wrong? What happens if you're wrong and at the end, there's just nothing? Then you've done the best you could to make an impact on those people around you. Right? I did everything I could to make the world a better place during my time here. I did my best to lift people up that I came in contact with. And if there's nothing, no harm. But if I get to the other side of it and the question isn't some balancing question around did you do good, did you do more good, or did you do more bad? One of the questions to that is, well, like what's the scoreboard to that look like? I don't know how you score that. Like there's people out there that are saving cat, like I don't know, how many of you just go adopt cats? None of you. I'm not even gonna give you time to answer the question. I hope none. Does that give you points? I don't know. It seems like it shouldn't. I mean, they seem like evil creatures to me. I mean, I'm not much of a cat person if you haven't picked up, but how do you score that? Those are things that we have to we have to be able to wrestle with. You need to understand why is it that you believe what you believe? My friend, we had this conversation, and I said, there's some people out there that believe that what the Bible says isn't quite enough. That somehow there's got to be more to it. There's different groups out there that say, what Jesus did on the cross, that was pretty good, but it wasn't quite enough. You need to understand that difference. You need to understand that difference. So I want to give you just some tips on asking questions. How am I doing time-wise here? Am I out of time already? I'm out of time already. There we go. Very good. I'm 3 pages in. I got I want to give you just some tips on how to craft your questions, because I think you may find these valuable. I know I found them valuable. Number one, with your questions, make them familiar, not foreign. If you're going to ask people questions that they're going to know the answer to, also ask them questions in the context in which they would understand, right? If I came out here and I started to talk, that I'm a very simple person by now. Anybody here not look at me and say, simple guy? No. That's what you think when you look. Jess is simple. Jess knows how to eat donuts. He doesn't know how to make donuts. So don't try to ask me questions around how do you make the donuts. Ask me the questions around how do you eat the donuts. Right? Find what's familiar, not foreign. If you start to tell me, when you have to let the dough rise, no, I don't. I know how the donuts go down. I don't know how they. I don't know that. That's where I was. The example that I have here is you don't ask people what they think. You don't say, what do you think about substitutionary atonement? That's a foreign thought. What you could say is, have you ever felt like someone took the fall for you? Have you ever been in a situation where someone took the blame for you, or maybe you took the blame for somebody else? See the difference? Make it familiar. Number two I have is build confidence before depth, right? Don't go to the deep waters right away. You don't walk up to somebody like, and a variation of this, Trace and I were taught at one point, and I think this is fantastic advice. Don't be weird. You can laugh at me, but you've all had conversations with weird people, and it wasn't fun. Don't be weird. You don't go up to somebody and you say, hey, what happens when you die? That makes you weird. That's what it does. It's like easy to spot. It's real easy to spot, right? You need to have that conversation. You need to build that conversation. And then you say, hey, and sometimes you even have to say, may I have permission to ask you a difficult question? You may not be able to answer this question. What do you think happens in a situation like this? What do you think happens, right? This is one that I didn't know the name for it, but it's called the recent spaghetti. I don't know how to spell spaghetti. How do you spell spaghetti? S-P-A-G-H. The recent spaghetti principle. You don't ask, what'd you have for dinner last Tuesday? You say, have you had spaghetti lately? Right? Like, if I were to ask you what you had for dinner last Tuesday, what would you answer? Like that's not an easy question to answer. You got to think about that. But if you say, hey, have you had this for dinner recently? You probably you all could answer that. It's an easier thing to go. Using these principles or these tactics, it respects people's minds and their hearts. And I think you'd find this is what Jesus did. And I think that's what wise leaders and disciple makers do too. I also want to give you this idea. You don't have to evangelize loudly. Like I don't know, like when I was having a conversation with Dan Craig before services here, and Brendan's going on a trip, I think this week, and I believe she has the opportunity on this trip that she's going to be able to visit the beaches of Normandy, if I'm not mistaken. And I can only imagine what what she does, right? Okay. I can only imagine what a solemn and holy place that must be. Closest place I've been to that was in the Alamo. I was in the Alamo. I've been into the Alamo, and it was just, if you've ever been to a place like that, or Gettysburg, like there's different where you go to, and it's like, wow, like blood was shed here for a very emotional reason. Now, if you've ever been to the Alamo, when you see the Alamo on TV, if you're watching a ball game or whatever, and there's the Alamo on TV, it's like a holy place. But if you turn 180 degrees around, it's Ripley's Believe It or Not wax museum. It's pretty much a tourist trap if you turn around. But in between the Alamo and the stuff across the street, there is a monument, and it has the names of the people who died in the Alamo. And when I was there was somebody who was standing on that monument preaching, right? He was being loud and trying to evangelize. And I don't know that he was attracting a lot of folks. And I share that with you because there is a solemnness in the challenge that we have been given to share the good news to the ends of the earth. But it doesn't say that you have to do it loudly. So for those of you who say, well, I'm a little more quiet in nature, I want you to know it still applies to you. The invitation's still there. The opportunity is still there. You can do things like ask somebody their story. You can ask people how they make sense of life. How'd you figure out what your purpose in life was? Why do you think people deal with suffering? Right? There's different questions that you can ask. Something I want you to consider is how questions can disarm defensiveness. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people that sort of have their walls up, their shields up. That if you come at them and you come at them in a sincere way and you ask them some of these questions, you can find that the opportunity to really connect with them is right there. So I want to encourage you today to consider what question would you ask a neighbor or a coworker or a family member that could open the door to a spiritual discussion? What are some of those questions? And maybe you just need to write down the idea, or maybe you just need to write down the person, and then you need to think, okay, well, maybe there's an example of how Jesus encountered people like this. It's not that you go and beat on their door and say, hey, I got to teach you all these things. No, it's not that you need to take a sermon or you have to take a video and give to them. It's that you just ask a question, and perhaps that's what opens the door. I made a note here, and it just says, be interested and be genuinely interested in people. Interested people. When you are interested in people, people will find you interesting. And that's sort of an odd thing. I would actually encourage you, has anybody ever watched Whose Line Is It Anyway? Like they do different games here in this thing, in this improv setup. One of the games that they play is the question game, where they can only ever say something and it has to be a question. I would encourage you to actually play that game yourself. I would encourage you to go through a conversation and just ask questions. See how many questions that you can ask in one conversation. There was a time that we were coming home from, was it Warren or my in-laws or wherever it was, and Brendan was asking questions. Oh, was she asking questions? I mean, she was young, and she was asking questions to an annoying point. And they would go this direction, then this direction. They'd be all over the place. But we actually did something where Brendan asked questions, and I think Jess counted the questions so that the kids would all stay awake on the way home. And in a 30-minute car ride, she asked 75 questions or something. It was pretty impressive. But what made you say that? What brought you to that conclusion? And when you're interested in people, people will find you interesting, and I think you'll find something about that. I'll also just throw out there to ask about comparisons. How do you compare this to this? And it doesn't. I mean, these can be. These don't have to be deep evangelical type questions. I'll ask when kids have their friends over. I'll ask the friends questions like, well, which candy bar do you prefer, Reese Cups or Milky Ways? The correct answer is, of course. Oh, I was hoping to generate some controversy there, but not doing. But what makes you prefer a Reese Cup over a Milky Way? Oh, I like peanut butter. I'm sorry? Whichever. That's true, right? But, ask comparisons. What are the last couple of movies that you saw? I saw this one, I saw this one. Oh, which did you prefer? I prefer this one. What makes that? What makes you say that? You'd be amazed at how that builds connection for you. Um, Ask about extremes. Ask about is it A Tale of Two Cities starts out with it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. What's the best and what's the worst you've encountered? Right? And you might be really interested. I have a note here, and this is where I think we may have a separate study, and this might be a multi-week study for later this summer. But I made the note, don't fear hard questions. Do not be scared of hard questions. One of the enemy's favorite tactics is to try to discourage you, and he'll discourage you by making you feel inadequate or unqualified to be able to answer or to be asked a question that you can't answer, right? And so one time I had a guy said to me, he said to me, can God create something so big that he can't lift it? Have you heard a question like that before? A few of you are shaking your head, like, and it's an interesting question because when it comes to you, it's like, well, can God do that? Could God create something that was so big that he couldn't lift it? And this type of a question is called a paradox. And it's called a paradox because it violates the rules of logic. So it's like, well, is it that he can't create something so big, or is it that he just isn't strong enough to be able to lift something that he creates, right? It was this sort of a catch-22 or darned if you do and danged if you don't type thing. What I didn't realize is that there's a flaw in that type of question, of these paradoxical questions. And there's 3 laws of logic that go into that. I find this stuff fascinating. I don't know if you would. Would this be something that we would want to dig into at some point? Is that shaking your head? Yes, Steve? Would you be interested? Would anybody else be interested? Like, Sean's giving me a thumbs up. Sean and I have actually done some work on that. Whether or not he remembers, I don't know. He's a sharp guy, but sometimes, but there's rules to how we think. There's things that we need to take into consideration. And we need to be able to see the flaws in some of the reasonings that people put forth. Right? So I'll put that on the list. But there's actually 3 laws of logic that we could potentially dig into. I'll just tell you, I have this quote from C.S. Lewis that reads, "Nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk nonsense about God." Right? So when people ask some of these things, that's where we are. If somebody asks you a question and you don't know the answer to it, I want you to know it's okay. It's okay for somebody to ask you a question that you don't know. Because what that is that's actually an invitation for you. You could say something as simple as, you know what, I don't know, but I think we'd be better off if I did a little bit of exploration of that. God's not threatened by our questions, and we don't need to be threatened by questions about God either. Sometimes the best answer is to simply point out that we need to do a little more work with that. I think, where am I at time-wise here? 37. I think that's where we're going to stop today. We are going to move into next week. We're going to move into some more tactical things on communication. I'm just curious, how many of you here will be involved in some way, shape, or form with Camp for Kids? Let me ask a different way. Is there anybody here who will not be involved in some way, shape, or form with Camp for Kids? A couple of you, okay. It's gonna have value for you no matter where you are. But I think one of the best things we can do is to be equipped to communicate well with people, because you may have the opportunity to come along and encourage somebody. You may have the opportunity to discuss with family members. You may have, of campers or counselors. You may be out there on one of the weeknights and you have the opportunity to interact with, just people from the campground, right? So let's look at some things to help equip us in that regard. So that's where we're going to go next week. To that end, I'm going to hit stop on the recording, but are there any questions, comments, or answers about questions?